Dag, before we kind of talk about the future, I do want to go back in time. And when Steve Jobs came to you, saw your app in the App Store, and at least in his view, at least as the legend has it, he saw something pretty revolutionary. That effectively became the backbone for Siri. It's hard to believe that was, what, 15 years ago, 16 years ago? And I am curious as to what the evolution of Siri has been and whether it fit with the original vision that Steve Jobs articulated to you back in 2011.
Yeah, so this is an area that Steve was interested in for over a decade. And we actually launched Siri as an app in the App Store back in 2010. And just 2 weeks later, he called us up and invited us over to his house for a conversation. Like I said, the way he described this was, I finally saw someone who cracked how to use artificial intelligence in a consumer-friendly way. So this was an area of personal interest of his, and so that was the impetus behind their interest in acquiring the company and everything that's happened subsequently. In terms of where it's at in the development of it, I think we obviously know that there's been some missteps along the way as it pertains to the execution of consistently making Siri better and making it a bigger part of your life. I don't think there's any question about that, but I'm actually quite optimistic with where they're at today.
Well, I want to talk about where they are at today and where they are going, and not just with Siri specifically, but just overall this idea of a voice or digital AI assistance, if you will, for just regular folks like you and me, or at least me and Katie. You're different. But we get to this idea that I think a lot of us do see the utility in, or the potential in it. What more needs to be put into it to make it as effective as I think some of those early ads made it out to be?
Well, as we speak, Siri's on the operating table right now getting a much-needed brain transplant with this Gemini partnership. So that will bring the intellectual level of Siri up to state-of-the-art. And that's essentially been the limiting factor on how it can help you as a person and as a user get more value out of it. There's some other things we can talk about in terms of how Apple can uniquely take advantage of what Apple does to make this differentiated relative to some of the others. But yeah, I would say, Siri is going to be at the forefront of this almost for free. Having a relationship with Google and with the Gemini integration, they're already getting paid $20 billion a year, and from Google for having Google be the search default on iPhone. And now they have a $1 billion a year deal to get access to the latest and greatest, frontier models in the world. So you can argue that, inadvertently or not, Apple's actually in a pretty good position right now.
Right. Well, I want to talk about that a little bit more because in the last year or so, I saw a quote from you saying that Siri was the last thing that Apple was first on. And then, I'm taking a look at the notes you sent over to us today. And as you say, Apple is inadvertently in a shockingly good place regarding AI. So let's talk about the overall AI stance here, because beyond Siri or, building on Siri, where do you see the green shoots for this company?
Well, let's start with Siri itself. Remember that, back a few years ago, when all the AI craze started up with this new breakthrough, companies were putting, hundreds of billions of dollars into this R&D. Now, Apple can come at this with 3 years of hindsight and start targeting, their investments towards things that they're uniquely qualified to do, like client-side versions of LLMs, large language models, the privacy aspect, which is going to be a huge key to how much people trust Siri and use Siri, and then the channel itself is so huge. Despite being behind technically, Siri still has between 500 million and 1 billion users per month, and you don't have to download a thing. All you have to do is update your OS, and all of a sudden you've got an incredibly state-of-the-art Siri right there. And then you start talking about all of the sort of commerce and all the other models that things that we had been working on for many years already, like using Siri to buy things, to do things for you. In fact, back in the day, when we were describing this whole virtual assistant idea to venture capitalists and others, we called it a do engine. So right now, if you look at the perspective of all of the different players in this business, almost all the agents are essentially answering questions. There's very few, and we're just starting to see the early signs of them actually being able to do something for you. And I think Apple is uniquely positioned there.
Well, Dag, I also want to broaden this conversation outside of just Apple, because we were talking about this earlier in the show, that you think about OpenAI, it feels like it has tentacles into so many companies in these public equity markets. And of course, the news today from the Wall Street Journal that Amazon also looking to invest a big chunk of change in them as well. You write OpenAI is in trouble. Tell us about that, since obviously that has ripple effects here.
Well, by trouble, I mean, think about who they're competing with. And you can argue which model is the best right now, but there's 2 or 3 that are right at the top. And OpenAI is the only one of them that doesn't have an existing user base and channel to reach. So, Google search, for example, everybody thought search revenues were going to decline with the advent of this advanced AI. That hasn't happened. Apple's already got a pretty good business. You can see their revenues haven't declined. Siri usage hasn't really declined even since this breakthrough in AI. So, OpenAI, for the first time, last week, decided that they're going to start advertising, which is something they have sworn off as kind of, if you ever see us advertise, you know that we're a little bit desperate. I mean, there's been people that have in the company that have said that. So you could feel they're under the pressure now of spending so much money into this tech without having real revenues behind it. And all of their competitors, generally speaking, maybe with the exception of Anthropic, who's got a focused enterprise strategy, have existing businesses and can just keep investing without the need to worry as much about the commercialization and revenue side.